Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Working Group Session number 4. My name is Brenda Corona. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group, I welcome you to our Working Group session, who will have in our panelist group, we have Juan Bertago, and then we have James Fedrich, who will be providing a few slides for today's meeting. As this working group, we want to remind you all for these housekeeping reminders that this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the IS's permission. In these collaborative working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. We are utilizing the Slido tool to help incorporate feedback from everyone that's in the meeting. As well, if you have any comments during the call, feel free to raise your hand, and we encourage any questions via chat as well. To ask a question during the WebEx, please utilize the raise hand icon located in the lower middle of your screen. This will allow us to unmute you. Please make sure to not unmute yourself twice because it will lock your muting capability. So make sure if you do have a question, keep your hand raised and we will call on you, and make sure to state your full name and affiliation so we can address those questions. As well, for the Slido, we do have that incorporated in today's meeting. They'll look like these icons, but feel free to edit or utilize anonymous feature when answering or asking questions or providing feedback. We do have about 3 questions, and one will be a ranking question, and my colleagues will be able to address those questions and how we are expecting maybe participation. But we hope everyone has a great meeting today, and we want to give everyone a quick rundown on the agenda for today. Today we'll dive in quickly to today's goals and schedule update with Juan, and then James will come up to speak with the BA level market power mitigation history and level set, and then Juan will continue on with the Slido polling about initial reactions and discussion areas and next steps. And lastly, I'll close the call for everyone today, and then we will wrap up and talk about maybe the next meeting we'll have maybe in the next few weeks. But thanks everyone for the past few weeks on the cancellations. I was out, but hopefully everyone was able to catch up on the last 3 meetings we had and review those recordings. All those recordings, every chat question polling are available at the KISA website for Price Formation. So now I'll go ahead and introduce, one last thing, we do have the ISO Policies Initiative Stakeholder process. Today we are currently on the working development, so we are in the pre-proposal development phase, so it's currently not in the proposal development phase as mentioned in this graphic, but this is an idea of what we're going towards, hopefully with the straw proposal in the horizon. We are currently phasing in on working on those things. My team will go over other specifics on what we're planning to do in terms of schedule, but other than that, this is just a high-level view of where we're going as we're currently in the pre-proposal development phase. And now I'll go ahead, I think we could go ahead and skip this slide. This was already introduced in the past, but action plan. So I'll go ahead and change that one. And then the next slide is the goal.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take this one. Thank you, Brenda, and thank you everybody for your attendance here today. As Brenda mentioned, we are going to have a couple of Slido polls at the end of this session. I do want to highlight the thing that she mentioned as far as the ability to provide that feedback anonymously, so you will have that option to select. We have a couple of write-in comments, so if you wish, please feel free to leverage that in providing your feedback here. But want to just kind of frame up the discussion here for today's working group session. Really going to hand this off to our policy lead here in James Friedrich to provide kind of the history and the context of the current BAA level market power mitigation construct as it exists today. And we want to do this because we feel that we need this level set in order to inform the future discussions regarding 2 questions that we're asking here of this community to provide their feedback on, and that is, any potential enhancements to that existing methodology. So we want to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of how it is operating today so that we can then talk about those enhancements. And then the determination of whether the California ISO BAA should be included in this BAA level market power mitigation construct. The other piece that we're going to do today, following that level set in the history of the BAA level market power mitigation, is we want to walk through a ranking question through Slido, and of course it will have kind of open text to be sure to allow you guys to include anything else that you feel should be included here. But we want to identify what we want to go over what we have identified thus far in the conversation, and then prioritize the themes that warrant dedicated sessions. So we have talked about going into this next phase of stakeholder presentations, getting into more granular discussion on these theme areas, and really begin that problem statement formulation. And as a result of this prioritization, we'll also have this in a comment template following this session for those who are not able to attend here live right now and provide their feedback via Slido. And you're watching this on a recording sometime in the future here, you'll be able to also provide your feedback through that comment template. And we're going to use that to set the schedule for the subsequent PFE working group sessions so that those who are wanting to present their perspective on these different themes have, when that date will be, which session it will be, and we can all prepare together as we begin diving deeper into the issues here that we've uncovered through the discussions thus far. That I will come back at the end here, but let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And if we could, I'll give the floor to James Friedrich, and if we could make him presenter, please.
Can you hear me? All right. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then one more slide after this one. So thanks, Juan, for inviting me to speak today. So after Working Group 3, felt like there was some fundamentals to go back over. There was a little bit of confusion about when we talk about BA level market power mitigation, what exactly do we mean? And we felt like it was important to talk about some of the history of this concept as it's been adopted in the EIM, some of the early stakeholder discussions around this topic that were happening during the formation of the EIM and shortly after, and how it's relevant today to the EDAM. And we think that context can provide a better foundation for stakeholders to begin thinking about enhancements to the approach, and we can begin to talk about that in this working group. So for my purposes today, I'm hoping that this presentation will answer the following questions. First is, what exactly is BA level market power mitigation? Second, what are the concerns that BA level market power mitigation is intended to address? Third, what is the precedence and history of BA level market power mitigation in the Western EIM? And fourth, how might BA level market power mitigation procedures be improved? Now, that final question, we'll only talk about, the very basics of that final question today, because we want to leave it more to the working groups to discuss that in more detail. But at least in my presentation, I'll tee up the fourth question and some possible answers to that question that we can dive deeper into in later working group sessions. So today is a little bit more backward looking than forward looking in this presentation, but we'll have time to, in future sessions, to get more forward looking. Let's move to the next slide. Also, I just want to say before I begin that I am monitoring hands in the attendee list, and I will stop at the end of a slide if I see a hand. So please don't wait for me to pause. If you have a question about any of the material on the slide or want to ask a question or make a comment, please do raise your hand, and I will stop at the end of the slide and call upon you. Okay, so the concept of BA level market power mitigation, the history of it is intended to address what we call structural market power in the Western EIM BAAs. And so BA level market power mitigation at one time in the EIM formation was referred to as structural market power. That's how you might have been familiar with it in the past. You could also think of BA level market power mitigation as a special application of local market power in that and we'll talk a little bit about why that is in the slides. But I do want to make sure it's not, the term BA level market power is not confusing. So we really want to emphasize what exactly it is. And we've struggled a little bit coming up with a good buzzword for this concept without making it too long. So we hope that that term is not too confusing. Looking back at some of the historical stakeholder concerns when the EIM was formed, various groups, including various stakeholders, including the Market Surveillance Committee and Department of Market Monitoring, back in the mid 2014, 2013, when the EIM was being formed and developed, raised issue with the potential for BA-wide market power in the formation of the EIM, and that concern was especially prominent for entities that would be joining the EIM that owned a majority of the generation within their BAA. And this concept was referred to as sort of structural market power. Structural market power being that the generation within the BAA is more or less consolidated with one or few entities. So let's go to the next slide. So on the concept of structural market power, the Department of Market Monitoring uses several tools to assess and does so, continues to do so today for the California ISO and reports these in their annual reports. These tools include pivotal supplier tests and residual supply indexes. These are common tools to measure the prevalence of structural market power and help to determine whether or not a market is structurally competitive. So let's go to the next slide. So these figures are just examples from the 2022 annual report on market issues and performance on page 155 from the Department of Market Monitoring. These are both measuring or metrics to assess structural competitiveness of the California ISO BAA. And the purpose for showing these slides or these figures in this table is just to demonstrate the ways with which one could assess structural competitiveness by looking at these tests. The top table is measures by year of the amount of times that the California ISO BA fails residual supply indexes with 1, 2, or 3 pivotal suppliers. And the bottom table sort of breaks that out by quarter, so you can see how that's distributed across the year. So these are just, again, the point of bringing up this slide is not to comment about the California ISO's structural competitiveness, but the intention is to show that the structural competitiveness is something the Department of Market Monitoring monitors for the CAISO. In the past, has monitored for some of the EIM entrants, which we will talk about in the upcoming slides, and just to get you a feel for what structural competitiveness might actually mean. Let's go to the next slide. So in the EIM filing, in response to concerns by stakeholders, by the Market Surveillance Committee and Department of Market Monitoring, the California ISO filed in its original EIM filing sort of the option to conduct local market power mitigation on the EIM interties to prevent the exercise of market power as it relates to the structural market power idea. And FERC advised that the ISO could do such a thing, but under the condition that the California ISO must show evidence that such mitigation is necessary. And so what was done at the time is the Department of Market Monitoring was geared up to evaluate the structural market power in the Pacificor BAs, Pacificor being the first entrant into the Western EIM back in the day. And this assessment of structural market power is going to be used to demonstrate whether or not BA level market power mitigation was in fact necessary in the EIM. And the conclusion had been that the Department of Market Monitoring back in the day could not conclude that the two Pacificor BAs would be structurally competitive. And similar findings were made for Nevada Energy, which was the second EIM entrant. And so the process back then was that anytime a new EIM entrant or new EIM entity would join the EIM, the process would have been that the Department of Market Monitoring would have conducted these types of structural competitiveness assessments and made recommendations whether or not these types of mitigation procedures should apply to these BAs. Let's go to the next slide. So in the beginning of the EIM, it was sort of a one-off process, and that sort of one-off process was done with Pacificor and with Nevada Energy. Shortly after the EIM filing, the CAISO conducted a series of sort of EIM year one enhancements. And in this particular initiative, EIM year one enhancements phase 2, the California ISO filed with FERC to apply market power mitigation procedures of EIM transfers on EIM interties as a permanent feature of the market. And the basic idea was that it sort of, one, it obviated the need for a specific structural competitiveness assessment by DMM every time somebody joined the market, and we wouldn't have needed to file with FERC every single time someone joined, and that reduced obviously some of that burden. But the feeling was that, well, you know, with the EIM entities that were set to join the EIM at the time, the likelihood of having different findings from those of Pacificor and Nevada Energy seemed to be quite small. And so the assumption being that, well, this is a feature of the EIM that needs to be permanent and inclusive of all of the EIM entrants as they joined. And it should be noted that the California ISO in these tests is deemed structurally competitive. It has a different market structure than many of the EIM entities, as it's not vertically integrated, and we have decentralized generation and such is not included in these measures. What I did not find, and others may know, is if there was any formal declaration of the California ISO being structurally competitive. It seems to me that the history shows that there was just sort of an underlying assumption that the California ISO was structurally competitive, and then therefore the BA level market power mitigation measures did not apply to the California ISO, but I haven't found any sort of formal assessment of that and to date. But it's obviously something that's come up in the working groups, and something that we want to elaborate on is whether or not, you know, when we look towards enhancements of the BA level market power approach, whether or not the California ISO it's appropriate to continue to deem the ISO BA structurally competitive, and whether or not to include it in any sort of grouping approach or not. Let's go to the next slide. So we talk about that. I hope that was a helpful history in terms of what the concerns were in the formation of the EIM in terms of structural or BA level market power, what some of the history was in terms of the timing of the filings and different enhancements that were made as time went on. And now I want to talk a little bit about okay, now if there is BA level market power mitigation, how do we know and what do we do about it? So BA level market power is very similar to a flow-based transmission constraint in a local area, in that when a BA transfer constraint binds, a BA transfer constraint being transfers between two EIM BAs, this can create isolated and price-separated areas within the larger system, just as flow-based transmission constraints can. And so when a BA loses access to competitive imports, it might find itself in a situation where it faces higher prices in that BA because it doesn't have access to that otherwise competitive supply outside. It was thought that this type of structural market power can be effectively countered by expanding the local market power mitigation techniques that we had to include what we'll call congestion or a binding constraint on a transmission or scheduling constraints leading into an EIM BA. We'll go to the next slide. So generally, when you have operating a market with multiple balancing areas, you can have market prices within those balancing areas be different. And one of the reasons for potential price differences between areas is congestion or a binding constraint along the transmission paths or scheduling paths that connect different BAAs. So when there is a binding constraint leading into a specific BAA, the prices in that area with which is cut off from the rest of the market are likely to rise. It's not necessarily so that they'll rise, but they're likely to rise relative to neighboring areas because, as I explained, they're no longer able to access competitive supply from outside of their local area. And again, that concept is no different than local market power mitigation, in which a local area within a BAA is cut off from receiving supply from the rest of the market. Next slide, please. So when you have price differences that arise in BAs across the regional market, it's captured in what we'll refer to as the power balance constraint shadow price for each BAA. And so when the power balance constraint shadow price in an EIM BAA is positive, it reflects it's a constrained region relative to the California ISO and other BAAs around it. And that signals to the market that to test the constraint for competitiveness or not, which is, again, exactly similar to how local market power mitigation is done, in which we identify binding transmission constraints and assess those binding constraints for competitiveness. So generally what the power balance constraint shadow price does is it reflects the cost of an additional unit of electricity to be delivered into the constrained area. And when that shadow price is positive, it has price separated itself away and becomes sort of a constrained region away from the broader market. Next slide, please. So the shadow price of the power balance constraint for an EIM BAA is based on the system marginal energy cost. So it's not a marginal cost of congestion component of the LMP that we want to be clear. It shows up in the SMEC, and so you'll have different system marginal energy costs for different regions within the EIM when these shadow prices are different. And as I sort of mentioned, when there's a positive shadow price for this constraint, it suggests that binding constraints are affecting transfers into that particular BAA, and therefore there is not access to competitive supply outside of the local area. Question in the queue.
Can you give me a little bit of clarification on that? Because my understanding of the SMEC is that in general, the SMEC is the marginal cost for the resource in the EIM footprint. And you're now saying that that SMEC is not just an energy cost, but it also has a portion of the shadow price due to congestion in it. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, so in this case, the way that EIM is modeled, the price separation between EIM areas is reflected in the power balance constraint shadow prices. And so when there's a positive shadow price on the power balance constraint, it's indicating that there is price separation from the rest of the market. In other words, there is a lack of access to outside supply. And my point was really only to say that it becomes relevant to say how you know whether or not these constraints are binding through the power balance constraint shadow price. It becomes relevant in thinking about the actual test, like what triggers the test, how the test is performed, and it's relative to this shadow price here.
Okay, so where would we see this then? So for example, if I want to identify the SMEC, the existing SMEC, and I would go to the LMP and I can break the LMP up into the SMEC, the MCC, the MCG, you know, all the respective components of the LMP. Where would I see the shadow price if I'm understanding that the SMEC is the baseline and it gets added somehow, but not in the MCC. So where would we see that? And how could we essentially trust but verify that this shadow price is a shadow price that is arising within the system based on the information that is available to the participants in the system?
Yeah, so George has his hand up, but I'll attempt a response and let George elaborate from the audience. So the way that it works, in my understanding, is that the California ISO is sort of the reference. You can think of it as sort of the reference point for how the SMEC is how the SMEC is calculated for the rest of the EIM. And so when there is a positive or negative power balance constraint shadow price, it's going to be relative to the CAISO BA's power balance price. And that's sort of how it's reflected. George, do you want to elaborate on that? Can we unmute George?
That's kind of different from my understanding, again, of the SMEC, because now we would be saying that the SMEC is not the system marginal energy cost, which is by definition what the SMEC is, but it would be a California marginal energy cost, which is not necessarily the same for the rest of the EIM footprint, right? The most expensive resource that's on the margin may not be in California.
But
Go
ahead, George. Yeah, go ahead, George. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, let me clarify this a little bit. So, in both EIM and DAME now with the extension with EDAM, the software will formulate what we call a power balance constraint for its balancing authority area in the market footprint. The shadow price of this power balance constraint is what we call the marginal energy cost for that BAA. It's specific to that BAA. And it's a pure energy, marginal energy cost. It doesn't have loss or congestion components because we use certain assumptions to break down the LMP to the various components. So that's the energy component for each BAA. Now, we make a transformation today in EIM to maintain the concept of the system marginal energy cost, which was pre-existing in our markets since MRTU, and we didn't want to introduce new concepts with the expansion of the market in the real time with the Western energy imbalance market. So what we do is we pick up the marginal energy cost for the ISO BAA, and this becomes the reference for all the other marginal energy costs for other BAAs are referred to. And it's like you have a system market energy cost for the entire system as if you were formulating a power balance constraint for the entire market footprint by just adding all the power balance constraints for each BAA in the footprint. So that transformation maintains the concept of the SMEC that we had from MRTU, so we didn't have to change everybody's settlement systems, at least for the ISO participants when we expanded the market. And the marginal energy cost now for the BAAs that are not ISO, they simply reported as part of the congestion component of the LMP. So basically any price differences between the ISO and another BAA in the market footprint finds its way into the congestion components of the LMPs in that other BAA. So basically we represent the difference in the marginal energy cost across BAAs as congestion, all right? And that works okay for EIM, but as you know, in EDAM, we'll have to separate the concept of transfer revenue, and then we can't continue this transformation, so we're going to go according to what we have put in the tariff for EDAM. We're going to go to the plain vanilla system where each BAA has its own marginal energy cost, and the difference between the marginal energy cost between BAAs is not going to show as congestion now, it's going to show as transfer revenue. Okay, so that's the conversion that we're doing. And how does this affect market power mitigation? BAA level market power mitigation. Today in EIM, we're comparing the system marginal energy cost, which is essentially the marginal energy cost of the ISO BAA, which we take as reference, with the shadow price of the power balance constraint of the BAA in question that we are examining and evaluating. And if it is positive, as James mentioned in his prologue here, that means that somewhere in the network there is exported energy from the ISO that finds its way in that BAA that is importing energy from the ISO along some transmission interface. And there is a constraint that limits that import into that BAA, which is resulting and manifesting as a higher power balance constraint shadow price for that BAA compared to the ISO. So the assumption in the BAA level mitigation for EIM assumes that the ISO is competitive, so that now suggests that this BAA is importing energy from a competitive BAA, but there are constraints which limit that import, which triggers now the evaluation for BAA level mitigation. So that's how it works in EIM.
So, and let me see if I'm understanding what you just said correctly. You're saying that instead of there effectively being the existing system marginal energy cost for the EIM footprint, including the non-ISO participants, or California ISO participants, there will be a California marginal energy cost, and then for the non-participants, non-ISO participants, there will be effectively a BA marginal energy cost. And then you're going to compare the BA marginal energy cost to the California marginal energy cost. So far, am I on track with what you're saying?
Yes, that's what is done now in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. That comparison, if the result is a higher power balance constraint shadow price for a BA than the SMEC, which is the one for the ISO, then it says that there is it suggests that there is a constraint on the imports into that BA from a competitive area like ISO, which triggers the evaluation for mitigation. If it's negative, it means it's below the ISO marginal energy price. So it suggests the opposite, that there is an export of energy from that BAA, and therefore there is no concern about market power in this particular evaluation.
So, okay. And that part does make sense to me there, although I wouldn't necessarily agree with the assumption that it's a constraint, it's a transmission constraint difference in price, but that seems to be the assumption that we're going with for the day ahead. How exactly would that work with, for example, the price swings that tend to happen in the ISO market that don't necessarily happen outside of the ISO. Part of that being due to brownouts, blackouts, and other events that are happening in California that are not impacting the non-ISO participants. Because what you're saying would suggest that those price spikes in California would then be interpreted due to the fact that the BA marginal energy cost has not spiked, that there is a export constraint on California.
So if you're referring to price differences within the BAA, these are because of congestion and losses in that BAA and also in other BAAs. Now, in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, we sort of insulate the effects of congestion within the BAA that it occurs. Okay, we don't propagate the effects of congestion in one BAA to other BAAs. That's what's done in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. The proposal for EDAM is to stop doing that. So if you look at the EDAM tariff, this is not going to happen anymore. We actually reflect congestion anywhere on the market footprint to all the locations, to all the nodes in the market footprint. So we're not going to be observing this artificial insulation of one BAA versus the other when it comes to congestion. So you'll see the effects of congestion anywhere it happens throughout the entire grid, of course, based on the sensitivity of the electric network.
Okay, so assuming that all of that process is acceptable, where would we see the results of this process so that we have some auditing capability on what is going on, as opposed to just...
Yes, these are published. Right, so these are the reports in MRI, which are available to the scheduling coordinator. I believe these are also reports in OASIS, so these are public, that they will tell you the energy cost for each BAA, and also the binding constraints with the shadow prices. They will tell you the market power mitigation evaluations. All right, so you'll be able to find out if a BA is mitigated for this BAA level mitigation effort. And if you're the SC of resources, you will also see in the MRI the mitigated bids for your resources. So there is extensive information to that effect that I think they're covered in training.
Okay. If possible, could someone share that training information? Because it sounds to me like if my resource needs to be mitigated, I would prefer that it simply not be called upon than it then be mitigated by a mechanism that I don't quite fully understand how the determination is being made given the utilization of CAISO as the reference bus, right? Because there could be CAISO specific concerns that are not impacting the rest of us.
Okay, we'll take that as an action item to provide a list of reports that can provide the information you're looking for. But what I was trying to say earlier, we're not going to be respecting this insulation anymore across BAA. So really, if there is a congestion that exists somewhere in the system, you'll see its effect throughout the market footprint. So that's the direction that we intend to go with EDAM.
Oh, I'm sorry, I must have gotten confused there. I thought earlier that you said that in EDAM, the idea was that the isolation occurs in EDAM, but does not occur in EIM. Now you're saying that the isolation...
The other way. The other way.
So
in EIM, yeah.
May be in EIM, but not in EDAM once EDAM goes active.
Right, so it's already in EIM, that's how it's built. So if you have congestion in the ISO, you don't see the effects, price effects, all right, marginal congestion effects in other BAs outside the ISO. But we're not going to do this with EDAM. We'll allow the effects to be shown wherever it's supposed to be.
Okay, and part of the crux of my question is that in the settlements that we see often enough, the marginal congestion component in EIM oftentimes gets unwound. right? Because it's a virtual congestion, it's not necessarily an actual congestion. And that's in the various BPMs specifically for the RT offset charge code. So what I'm trying to get at is if the shadow prices are going to be in EDAM, where do I see those shadow prices settle and where can I verify that I got paid or had to pay according to that shadow price and that it wasn't offset later on in some charge code?
Yeah, you'll see them in the decomposition of the LMP for the specific resource location. It has 4 components: marginal energy, marginal loss, marginal congestion, and marginal greenhouse gas. So you'll see all these components, and in fact, for settlement, we even break this to subcomponents. The congestion component is broken into subcomponents that says what piece of the congestion cost comes from which BAA. So
Right,
there is quite a bit of detail.
Earlier, the both of you said that it would no longer, this would not go into the marginal congestion component, that it goes in the SMEC, right? But I'm not
Today,
I'm sorry?
Today, a very simple example, let's say the marginal price at the ISO. Let's forget about congestion losses and just look only scheduling limits, okay, scheduling congestion or transfers between BAAs. So, right, so let's say the ISO BAA has a marginal price of $20. I'll pick one and EDAM, and some BAA in the market footprint has a marginal price of $50. There's a $30 differential, right? So what we do in EIM today, we pick up the $20 as the reference, which is the ISO BAA price, and then we say, this is the SMEC, everybody sees that price, the marginal energy cost for the entire system, and that price differential of $30 for the nodes of the other BAA is shown as congestion in the congestion component. All right, we see them, we're unraveling this, and we say, okay, well, this is not really congestion. So instead of having 20 in the entire system and 30 showing as congestion, we separate the energy price and we say the ISO has 20 and the other BAA has a marginal energy cost of 50. There's no congestion now. The difference between the 20 and the 50, the $30 will show as transfer revenue. So that's the transformation of these LMP decomposition to components as we're moving from EIM to EDAM.
So then, as I'm understanding you, and I just want to make sure I get it, is that the LMP is now going to have a SMEC and MCC and a GHG, a loss component, and a transfer revenue component.
The transfer revenue is not a component of the LMP, it's the manifestation of the difference between the marginal energy cost across BAAs. Okay, it's like a price differential for energy transferred between BAAs, and it has its own new settlement handling in EDAM. It's not handled as congestion, it's handled differently. And that's all part of the EDAM filing, and that's why we're separating it from congestion. We saw it separately now.
Okay, and then how does that compare to the virtual congestion component that currently exists in EIM, which is often unwound in the RT offset charge code? Could that not be treated in the same manner?
Are you referring to the effect of virtual schedules that are scheduled in IFM today, but they don't materialize in real time? I'm having a hard time pinpointing what you mean by virtual congestion.
So I would unfortunately end up asking or reverting to what Kaisa means by virtual congestion when I say virtual congestion. So there's a portion of the congestion component that is considered actual congestion, and if there are adjustments to that, it's generally made in the congestion offset charge code on the BA side. There's also a portion of congestion that is referred to in the BPM as virtual congestion. If there is an adjustment to that, it is generally made as part of the RT offset along with other adjustments. So that's the reference that I'm referring to in the virtual congestion. If I had to tie it to something, my understanding would be it would tie closer to what the advisory pricing is in EIM in order to direct the power flows. That's what I would say. That's what it's closely associated with, but it's not actual congestion. It's a synthetic or virtual congestion that is created within the full network model in order to resolve the power flows in the manner that is optimal. We'll go with that phrase, optimal.
So I can't follow the logic about virtual congestion. I'm unable to answer this question. We may need to take it offline and maybe pose your question, maybe have a separate conversation for me to understand exactly what you mean, because we don't have the concept of virtual congestion in the market. There is some settlement for the effect of virtual schedules to CRRs, just for the ISO. I'm a little bit familiar with that, but I think you mean something different. I don't understand what it is, so I won't be able to answer that question.
Okay, that's fine. And I do appreciate your time and your description. You already did answer this specific question that I asked, which that there will be a separate charge code that will have these transmission revenues in it. So that does help a lot.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
Question from JK.
From PJE. Really appreciate your taking the question, because I know we're dwelling on this topic for a while. So my question will be quick. First of all, is this topic only applied to WEIM, or considering that to extend it to EDAM as well?
So the BA level market power mitigation mechanism also applies to the EDAM. I'll just note, yesterday the CAISO published on the Price Initiative Enhancements stakeholder page a clarification and an update to our overview paper to clarify that the Price Formation Enhancements initiative is not going to be discussing whether or not these apply into the EDAM, because that is part of the EDAM policy. And so we were a little misaligned on that and wanted to make sure that that was corrected and clarified. So the answer to your question is yes, the BA market power mitigation intends to apply to the EDAM as well. And that when we think about enhancements to the approach, we're also thinking about it from the perspective of both the EIM and EDAM, and that you probably want to do the enhancements to both markets if possible.
Okay, that's really helpful. So I also have a couple clarifying questions. So first of all, when you say this the BIA level market power mitigation, will we also have a system level power mitigation applying to the overall WEIM area?
No. So yeah, so that's why, yeah, in the beginning I tried to express that the term BA level market power can be confusing. And one way to think about it, JK, is that it's the application of local market power mitigation procedures to EIM or EDAM transfer constraints, binding transfer constraints.
Right.
So
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm only asking because following by another question, is this applying to CAISO BA as well? Because if it does, then that will be, a different approach.
Yes, as of right now, the BA level market power mitigation procedures do not apply to the CAISO. It is part of the scope of this initiative to consider whether or not that's still appropriate. And so, that's not necessarily the focus of today, but that is part of what this working group will talk about.
Okay, that makes sense. And also, because of the order, the timeline when the market power mitigation will be applied in the real-time market, my understanding is if a BA fails its RSE test as being excluded in the WEIM market optimization, then the market power mitigation would not be applied to that BA. Is that right?
So that's a good question, and actually came up in the stakeholder comments. I think Edison had a similar question, and I don't know the answer, to be honest. George, if you know the answer, you can raise your hand. The question is essentially, if an entity fails a resource sufficiency evaluation and they're in a sense cut off from the EIM or the EDAM market, are they still subject, or I guess maybe even automatically subject to these type of market power mitigation procedures? If we don't have an answer, we'll oh, George popped up. George, can you help me with that question?
Yeah, so the resource efficiency evaluation process is really not related to the market power mitigation process. So if the triggers for the market power mitigation are met, they will be applied and followed up to, irrespective of whether the BA has failed or passed the resource efficiency evaluation. Now, you would expect that if they fail the resource efficiency evaluation, and they also take the option to freeze their transfers, not buy a systems energy, you would expect that the market power mitigation triggers will definitely satisfy the evaluation of that BAA for BAA level, and they may be mitigated as a result of that. But the two processes are not really linked. They are applied independently.
Right. I'm really curious how that will happen, because, you know, exactly as you described, there will be no transfer, but at the same time, because there's no transfer, there won't be any shadow price you can directly extract it from the LMP. That's really helpful. So my last question.
There will be shadow price, JK. So even if you freeze the transfers, there's still an electrical connection. So you don't really open the lines having the BAA being isolated. They're still connected with the grid. So you still have transfers, but they're constrained now. They're not optimized. They're constrained to a limit, which could be 0 or could be another value depending on what was the optimal transfer before, and you know all these details about the freezing of the transfer. So there is a limit that doesn't allow the transfer to be optimized, but because that limit is binding, you will have price separation. So you still have the prices for the BAA and the separation, even when the transfers are fixed.
I see what you mean. Okay, that really helps. Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks everybody for the questions, and thanks George for jumping in here. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit more on the market mechanics. So on the previous slide, we described that when the shadow price for the power balance constraint in an EIMBA is positive, it indicates price separation from the CAISO. And when this situation occurs, it triggers a dynamic competitive path assessment, or DCPA. So dynamic competitive path assessment is the same technique that we apply to local market power mitigation, in which we test a constraint, a binding constraint for competitiveness by using a 3 pivotal supplier test. This presentation does not intend to get into those nitty-gritty details of the DCPA. If those types of details are warranted in future discussions, we can get deeper into that. But for now, the time being, is that the intention of what we want to share is that, just like in local market power, when you have this binding constraint, we apply the DCPA to evaluate whether the available generation within the EIMBA can competitively meet its own demand without access to additional transfers using a similar 3 pivotal supplier methodology. Next slide, please. So just like in local market power mitigation, if the DCPA, or the dynamic competitive path assessment, discovers that the constraint is non-competitive, there is a process to adjust the bids of resources in the EIMBA that's affected. And this adjustment process involves potentially mitigating bids. Bids are not mitigated if they're lower than the reference prices that are used. But there's a series of reference prices where a bid could be mitigated to. It could be the competitive locational marginal price at their location, which is essentially the LMP with the uncompetitive portion of the congestion stripped away from the price, or potentially a default energy bid, which are calculated based on various procedures. There's also a negotiated bid option. So in essence, to say that if, in summary, if the DCPA fails for this constraint, all of the resources that provide, all of the resources within that BA are assessed for mitigation through these procedures and potentially subject to bids being reduced to one of these reference prices. Question in the queue?
If the DEB is insufficient to reach the level that you want, is it mitigated further, or is it only, so for example, we use DEB. Do you mitigate further? And by what mechanism do you mitigate further, or do you only mitigate down to the DEB value? You might be muted.
Thank you very much. If you're choosing the DEB option, what happens is that if the resource is subject to mitigation, it compares the bid that's submitted to two prices, to two reference prices. One is the DEB, and the other is the competitive locational marginal price at that location, which sort of, like I said, it takes away the non-competitive congestion component of the price. And if the submitted bid is higher than either of those prices, the market will mitigate to the higher of those two reference prices. Now, if the submitted bid is lower than those reference prices, the bid is maintained. So we say the bid is subject to mitigation because it's not necessarily so that the market will adjust the bid. It's only if the bid is higher than either of these reference prices. And before I go on, or I turn it back to you, if it's the case where the competitive LMP is higher than the default energy bid of that resource, the market will use the higher of the two reference prices. So it's not always necessarily the case that the resource bid is mitigated to the DEB if it's mitigated at all.
All right, so I think my question would be if the minimum of the competitive LMP and the DEB were greater than the price target that you were aiming for, is there additional mitigation, or is it just going to be the maximum of the two?
Right, so if the bid that's submitted is less than these two reference prices, then the bid stays the same. The bid is not mitigated.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. George raised his hand. He may want to add some context to that explanation.
Yes, so the question is how you mitigate a bid when there are multiple effects on the price that they have multiple congestion components. So in your question, you alluded that we may be doing sequential mitigation. You do one for one constraint, then you may do additional mitigation for another constraint. So that's not how it happens. Essentially, the mitigation is for all the components at the same time. So you calculate from the LMP decomposition, as James said, which are the competitive components and which are the non-competitive components. So you make that separation, and then you compare the sum of the competitive components is your competitive LMP at that location for which you are mitigating a bid. You're comparing that with the default energy bid and the submitted bid. So the portion of the submitted bid that is up to that competitive LMP component is not mitigated. The portion of the bid that is above that price, then it's mitigated to the DEB. So we go back to our example in our discussion where we had a $20 SMEC, and then you had $30 marginal congestion component because of transfer constraints in a BAA, and you have two physical congestions of that BAA that contributing to a location, congestion A $10, congestion B $5. At that location, your total price is 20 plus 30 plus 10 plus 5, right? That's $65. And let's say that the BAA has to be mitigated at the BAA level for the $30 uncompetitive congestion piece. And let's say that the $5 congestion is from a competitive constraint, but the $10 is not. So if you split the LMP at that location, the total LMP of $65 to competitive part, which is 20 for the ISO, which is competitive, plus the 5, which is the competitive congestion, $25. The rest, which is 30 plus 10, $40, is uncompetitive. Once you split that LMP to these two components, then you look at the energy bid that was submitted at that location, and you say whatever part of the energy bid is up to the competitive LMP, which is $25, it's not mitigated. Any portion that's above $25, all right, that will be mitigated to whatever the DEB is for that capacity. The DEB may be $30, let's say. So then the energy bid is going to be as submitted up to the $25 threshold, the competitive LMP, and after that will be mitigated to $30. Make sense?
Thanks, George. And I did want to add that there is a, albeit very simplified example that I have near the end of the slide, that maybe we could go back to this concept and walk through a little bit again about the mitigation price if a resource needs to be mitigated.
Okay.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So now, please do understand that anytime we put out examples, there are simplifying assumptions to be made, and that this example is not intended to demonstrate all of the nitty-gritty details of market power mitigation. But I wanted to isolate for folks a couple of key concepts that hopefully can make at least the high-level picture clear. So what we've got in this example are two balancing authority areas, one on the left, which is BAA, and one on the right, which is BAB. BAA has a generator, in this case, that can produce 70 megawatts at a $25 incremental energy cost. BAB has 100 megawatts of demand and has two generators within its BA, the sum of which those generators equal its demand. But you have one generator that's bidding at a $20 incremental price and one generator that's bidding at a $30 incremental price. So ideally, with access to the supply from BAA through a transfer, denoted through the red arrow, BAB would like to generate 50 megawatts from its unit on the top at $20 and then receive 50 megawatts for a $25 cost from the resource in BAA. The problem is that this transfer constraint between the two BAs is limited to 40 megawatts. And so the BAB cannot access all of the supply it otherwise would want from BAA. So that means that in this case, it must run the generator on the bottom at a $30 cost. So I highlighted the transfer constraint arrow in red to make it clear that there is a binding constraint, scheduling constraint or transfer constraint between these two BAs that prevents more competitive supply, BAB, from accessing more competitive supply. And the result of that constraint is a shadow price. Hey, Juan, just 1 second. I'm getting a notification my computer has got 1% battery. Can I take a 2-minute break to plug in my computer? Sorry about that.
Absolutely, James. No, not a problem. Thank you, everybody, for your patience here. Let's just give a moment. Appreciate the feedback on the discussion thus far here. We're hopeful that this is exactly what we were going for. So this background discussion, I think, will be a good launching point to the rest of the work group sessions.
Okay, sorry about that. Man, right before I got to deliver the punchline too. Sorry about that. Okay, so in this case, what I was getting through is that there's a binding constraint between the two BAs that keeps VAB from accessing the more competitive supply in BAA. And what you see here is this Lagrange symbol, this squirrely L below the red arrow and the $5 value here. And that represents the shadow price of that constraint. And so let's talk a little bit about that $5 shadow price. What that basically is saying is that in absence of the constraint, BAB would have been able to access supply $5 cheaper than what it has, than what it's incrementally using to meet its demand. And that $5 comes from the difference between the $30 generator it must run in its own area relative to the $25 generator it would have been able to use from BAA had that transfer constraint not been binding. And so in this case, because this transfer shadow price is a positive value, then BAB as the importing BAA that is facing this binding constraint, the resources within BAB are subject to mitigation. Now, again, I want to emphasize the phrase subject to mitigation. It doesn't mean that the bids are necessarily mitigated because of the procedures that George and I described on the last slide. Now, because there's some interest in talking about this, let me extend the slide a little bit and let's talk about this $30 resource down here at the bottom. So let's imagine that the $30 resource has a default energy bid of $22. Now, the market will not automatically substitute its $30 bid with the $22 DEB in this case, because the competitive LMP at that location is actually $25. And the competitive LMP is basically saying, well, what would have the price in BAB had been if not for this uncompetitive constraint between A and B? And that would have been, the competitive price would have been $25 because that's the supply I could have gotten from BAA. So the market would say, okay, I've got a $30 bid. The default energy bid is $22, but the competitive LMP at this location is $25. So the mitigation price in this case would be 25, or the higher of the two. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to transition to the last portion of this discussion. We've talked about some of the history, the mechanics between the EIM and EDAM, how pricing works. We've talked about what BA level market power mitigation is, how it's tested. Now let's talk a little bit about how might we be able to improve the procedures that were discussed in the issue paper. And again, this is not the things that we will evaluate in this initiative are not necessarily limited to this particular improvement, but we did want to sort of tee this up for further discussion. So this diagram here is similar to one that was posted in the issue paper, where you have 4 VAs in this example who are electrically connected in different ways. And in this case, you have a BAA A on the far left-hand side that has marginal energy cost of $30, and the group of VAs B, C, and D on the right are separated from BAA, denoted through these red arrows. The red arrows mean that these are binding constraints between the two areas. And because of these binding constraints, that puts upward pressure on the prices of these areas because they're not able to transfer in competitive supply from BAA, and therefore their marginal prices in those areas are higher, or in this case, $100 in each. So the previous example was really simple because it just involved 2 BAs. In this example, there's multiple BAs. Let's talk a little bit about how this might work. So the status quo procedure, the one that we do today, performs the dynamic competitive path assessment that we described in the previous slide independently for BAB, BAD, and BAC because it's price separated from the competitive area BAA. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about what this means. So let's isolate our thoughts on BAB, for example. BAB would be tested independently, in which its supply internal to its BA would be compared to the demand within the BAA without access to the transfers, and would be tested for whether or not this BAA has, or the constraint between BA and BAA and BAAB are competitive. But what it does not do is consider potential transfers from BAC and BAD. It's only considering the internal supply within BAB as part of the mitigation test. So if we go to the next slide, one way of potentially improving the BA level market power mitigation procedures is instead of testing BA, B, C, and D independently, you can group them together, in which the DCPA is performed by these BAs as a group, where you consider the transfer capability of supply between the BAAs and essentially testing all of the supply between them relative to all of their demand. And one potential benefit of doing something like that is it actually increases the amount of supply that's available to be competitive or potentially competitive within each of these BAs, and should, all else equal, reduce the amount of times that a BA is deemed uncompetitive, and could make the competitiveness assessments more accurate. And so that's essentially what the issue paper tees up a little bit, and what we want to discuss in this working group is whether or not a grouping approach might be helpful to improve the BA level market power procedures rather than testing these BAs in isolation. So that's the last slide of my presentation, and I'm happy to pause for some questions before I turn it over to Juan.
Thank you very much, James. Let's go ahead and unmute Callie, please.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with the Western Power Trading Forum. I have a very simple question on this slide. So if you were to go down this path of doing this grouping approach, in this example you have here, let's just say it was still determined that the red paths were uncompetitive. Would BAC still be mitigated, even though it has no connection to those constrained paths, or would just BAB and BAD be mitigated?
So George's hand popped up, so I'll let him elaborate. But my understanding is that BAC, even if it was still in the grouping approach, would be subject to mitigation, even if it's not directly connected with BAA and that uncompetitive constraint, because it's essentially still not able to access the competitive supply from BAA through BAB. George, can you elaborate on that?
Yes, you're correct. The main idea here is that we don't perform the BA level mitigation independently for BAAs B, C, and D, but they're essentially grouped together in one, let me use the term super BAA, that is composed of those three together. So instead of performing the DCPA on each of them, you perform it on the group, and then based on this result, you will determine whether all of them will be mitigated or none of them. Now, this assumes that these three BAAs that separate price-wise from BAA, they have unlimited transfer capability among themselves, so they operate as a single market section. That's not entirely true because there are still transfer limits between BAAs B, C, and D. However, our market power mitigation approach really looks at the market power mitigation solution and performs the analysis on that solution. And if at that solution those transfers are free to move, they haven't hit a limit, then those three really are a single, are a market subgroup that work together. So you perform the analysis, the DCPA on the group, and then based on that analysis, you either mitigate the entire group or none at all. Thank you.
Okay, that's helpful. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think we'll have to think through whether or not it makes sense for resources in BAC to be mitigated, given that they have no connection between the transfers that are constrained. Although maybe, and this might be getting a little bit too much into the details at this point, but maybe mathematically the way this would work is you would actually not have a non-competitive congestion component in BAC. I guess that depends on the shadow, the shift factors of that binding constraint, whether or not that feeds into BAC.
Right.
But
so
yeah,
all of these three,
some thought.
they have the same power balance constraint shadow price, which is individually $100. So let's say we abolish the SMAC. So we have $30 for BAAA and $100 the marginal energy cost for BAAs B, C, and D. So the power balance constraint for each of these three comes up with a shadow price at $100. Since this group is the importing group in the simplified figure, then they have constraint on importing $30 energy from BAAA, right? So the competitive LMP in this scenario is the $30, all right? Because BAAA is competitive, at least in this figure, okay? And then the bids in all resources in BAAs B, C, and D above the $30 competitive LMP, they will be replaced with the DEB. Now, in this simple scenario, you don't have any other congestion, just these transfer limits. Now, as probably James is going to mention later on, in this scenario, you assume that BAA is also competitive, right? And that's because you don't have other BAAs in the picture, right? In general, you may have different concentric areas, so you can only say the BAAs in the outermost area are the ones that are competitive because that's where all the energy is coming in and has constraints, input constraints to other hierarchical groups. So that will be a generalization of the simple approach that you see here. But what you see here essentially has BAA being competitive, and BAS B, C, and D will be evaluated for competition from all the resource supply meeting all the demand in that group, and they're mitigated potentially as a group.
Yeah, and I understand all that. I guess my high-level question is something that we might want to think through and talk through in these working groups is under this approach, whether or not it makes sense. I get that you test them all together, but whether or not it makes sense to mitigate BAC, given that it's not directly connected to the constrained imports. But again, I get all the mechanics of it. I just wanted to tee up that high-level question as something that we might want to talk through.
Yeah, but
as this working group goes on?
Yeah, it's important to not say that it's not directly connected because the important thing is that you see them as a group. You don't see BAC alone anymore. It's part of the BCD group. So yes, it is connected. It would normally import energy from BAA at $30 to serve its demand, but it cannot do that because of the constraints. So B, C, and D are situated exactly equally. You cannot get energy from A into any of the B, C, and D group to serve the demand. So it would be unreasonable to mitigate B and not mitigate C. They're equally situated. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I get that. If we can, a question or a discussion that we want to tease out later on of whether or not that makes sense. I was just trying to raise that as something that we can talk through later. Thanks.
Thanks, Callie. Next caller.
JK, I believe your line is unmuted.
JK, we can't hear you. Your device may be muted.
We'll come back to JK. Apologies, the last person that had their hand raised, can they please raise it again?
Yeah, I
Hands
saw hands up and down.
are going up and down. I'm not sure.
Adeline as well.
There you go,
Let's
Kyle.
go ahead and
Thank
unmute Kyle.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the presentation. It's really helpful and quite clear. I had two questions I have are, the first one is, maybe I missed this, but how is the group identified that ends up becoming subject to the DCPA in this type of example? And would it always be a single group, or is it plausible that there might be multiple groups that get tested? And then the second question is, James, you explained the benefits. Could you outline the downsides you see for using the grouping approach?
Sure. So for the first question, in the simplest form, BA groups are formed by price. So in this case, you have 3 BAs that all have the same $100 price. And so that's one way of forming the groups, is you look at the prices, or in this case, the marginal energy costs of these BAs and group them together. And could you have more than one group? Yes, absolutely. So in the issue paper, there is a more complicated version of this figure, which has sort of multiple steps of price separation. But one way to imagine this by looking at this figure is if the path between BAB and BAC were constrained, you may have prices in BAC that were, say, $150. And so in that case, you would test BAC as a group by itself, and then BAB and BAD together as a group. And exactly how you create those hierarchies of groups is subject to discussion in creating the approach, but that's a way of doing it. Let me make sure that helps before I move on to the second question.
Yep, very clear. Thanks.
Okay. In terms of downsides, the only thing that I'd like to explore, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure whether or not this is valid, but it could be the case potentially that what I would want to make sure, and what I think stakeholders would want to make sure, is that if I'm testing in a grouping approach, I'm not failing when I otherwise would have been passing being tested independently. So for example, if there was a possibility that, say, in this case, let's imagine BAB, is there a potential for BAB to pass the assessment tested by itself, but fail the assessment when tested as a group. I would think that the mitigation procedure would seek to be robust to that, because ultimately what you're seeking in an approach like this is there a way to assess competitiveness of supply more accurately by looking at transfers between BAs and access to competitive supply that are not just within BAB, for example. So at the top of my head, that's something worth exploring that could be a downside, but I haven't thought about it enough to know, or explored it enough to know if that's a possibility. But does that concern make sense, or at least?
It does. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you have any, or just curious if you had any other thoughts or concerns about the benefits of a individual approach relative to a grouping approach that come to mind, or were you just curious?
I think just curious at this stage. Thanks for outlining. It's helpful.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's go ahead and unmute Stuart, please.
Stuart, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Thank you, James. Just along those lines, I'm getting concerns that if we have let's say we had a particularly small BA that really overbuilt renewables and was continually, because of the overcapacity, bidding in particularly low. Is there not a danger in this approach that there's going to be over mitigation just because of that particular, that smaller BA in this example? I just wonder if this approach will lead to over mitigation, unintentional over mitigation.
I think so. I think what you are implying is similar to the concern I just expressed, in that what I would be looking at in this approach is that if you have, in your example, let's say a supply long BAA or even just a gen only BAA where it has a lot of supply and not very much load to serve within its EA. And so therefore, when tested independently, it may be more likely to pass the DCPA. But when considered as a group, is there the possibility that now when I'm considering exporting all that renewables to my neighbors in my group, that all of a sudden the group, I'm lumped in with this group that's no longer competitive? I think that's kind of what your concern is, and what I was trying to express.
I guess it is, and then in conjunction with that, if I'm in, to Callie's point, in BAC, and for some reason I'm bidding in a resource that I don't really want to run, I definitely wouldn't run it if it was at the DEB, and then because of BAA, it's getting DEB, frequently, and I'm not recovering the price beat from, I know we cover maintenance, we're supposed to cover maintenance, but it lags. But there's just different reasons I have it at that higher price than the price is getting driven down. But yeah, to your point, it's a similar concern to the issue you're raising. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and George raised his hand, he may want to add in.
So Stuart, on this apparent over mitigation scenario, what you really need to look at is what is the LMP in that BAA. So you're thinking of a small, it doesn't matter, some LMP, some BAA that has enough supply to meet its own demand, all right, and can export. So BAA-B, let's say this example, can meet its own requirements because it has adequate supply. So if we had tested BAA-B on its own, it would have passed, and then we wouldn't mitigate, right? Testing it as a group, although B has adequate supply to meet its own requirements, still, that's not enough collectively for B, C, and D to meet their pooled requirements together, which means that the entire group, B, C, and D, will see a potentially high LMP set by some resource that is pivotal in the entire group. if you need that pivotal supplier to meet the demand in the BCD group, that pivotal supplier can theoretically arbitrarily raise its bid, and you still select it and set the price for the entire group, B, C, and D. The fact that B has adequate supply to meet its demand, that doesn't help their LMPs being $100. In this scenario, there is no over mitigation, there is correct mitigation. You have to mitigate that bid for that pivotal supplier in the group because it can exercise market power, and that's how the MPM will work. And if you mitigate it down to $50, then the price for the entire group will be $50, and that's the correct outcome.
Thanks, George.
That was helpful.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and Stuart, let's go ahead and go to JK.
Hi, JK, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, great. I know I can trust my phone better than the computer. So your example makes sense. I only have a technical question. Do you think this bubbling approach is always applicable? Because I mean, like, this is like some case very clear you can actually group the things and make it a bubble, right? But I'm thinking like we actually have a network and there may be other areas have a different price beyond your BAC, or you know, you can think of other scenarios. I'm just wondering how you're going to do the group exactly.
Yeah, so it's a fair question, and I'm going to defer your question only because, you know, exactly how the groups become formed is subject to discussion in these working groups, and there are, you know, different ideas about how to do that, and so we want to, you know, work with you all to come up with what we think is the most reasonable way, you know, this simple example was just to demonstrate that a grouping approach may be preferable to independently testing as long as we can, you know, make the grouping approach robust to some of the concerns that have been raised. So
okay,
I know
yeah,
that's not answering. I know that's not answering your question, but
no,
yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah,
it's very fair. Yeah, I have a alternative thought, and I will appreciate your opinions on this. So it makes sense because when I look at this graph you're showing, it just remind me what we do for the local power mitigation, right? So basically, you will have a mitigated price for node C if there's a congestion, because that's how the LMP is constructed. You will be able to remove that shadow price if it actually contributed to the congestion. Because when you think about it, the line that's connecting A to B and D are congested, not only because, you know, those two nodes are drawing power from A, but also because the C is like indirectly or directly, you use the shift factor that contribute to the congestion. So it's like, you know, all of the three nodes are trying to draw power from A. So I guess whether do you think it is possible, like I always feel like grouping and bubbling is like a graphic approach that's more complicated, but we can do is once you identify there's a market power, we can do an aggregation on the BA level and just, you know, extracted those as nodes and do the analysis again. And then you can do a mitigation as those are nodes and then substitute back the BA level price to the local LMPs.
So I think that you're right, that if this were the case where these were, instead of saying BAAs, these were nodes internal to a BAA, yeah, you're right, there would be contributions. It could be demand from BAC that's causing the constraints between BAB and BAD to bind in this case, and would have a contribution to that. And I think that in this case, when you're testing the BAs as what's different about when you're testing the BAs as a group, I'm sorry, in BA level market power mitigation is that essentially the supply within, it's not so much shift factor based anymore, in the sense that you're testing the supply within BAC to assess whether or not the supply within the BA, without access to the competitive transfers, can competitively meet its own demand. And so the parallel in my mind sort of breaks down a little bit in that case, just because you're not able to in this test access competitive, or if it were the case where BAB was a competitive BA, you wouldn't account for that access to that competitive supply in evaluating BAC in isolation.
Okay.
So yeah, so, but there may be, I mean, the algorithm may be, yes, the algorithm's up to discussion. Maybe there's a way to, if it's desirable, to combine sort of the two approaches in a way where,
right,
in some cases, I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, because the binding constraints are different, so it's hard to, it's not straightforward to say how it works. But PGA will be willing to collaborating on this issue.
Thank you, JK.
Very good. Thank you, JK. And we will have a comment template afterwards, so if you want to kind of expand on that, we can leverage that for future discussions. That would be greatly appreciated. Before we go into the next section here, which will be the interactive and the Slido polling, so to speak, I just want to leave it as an open floor for any additional questions on anything that James has covered for us here today. Callie, let's go ahead and unmute Callie, please.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with the Western Power Trading Forum. I had, I guess, a more high-level comment to make or question. So all the prior working groups, we were talking about problem statements and principles. And obviously one of the feedback you got was we want some background information. So I completely appreciate you guys walking us through the current mechanics of how BA level market power mitigation works in Maine today. But I guess this conversation that just took place, which I appreciate, seems to be already jumping to solutions to consider, but we haven't even finalized the problem statements and really quantified the problems, which I thought, that was my understanding, was going to be kind of the order of this conversation. So I'm wondering if it's almost a little premature to be having detailed conversations about solutions and changes that can be made if we haven't solidified yet and kind of gotten to a consensus on the problems being addressed. So I was curious if you guys, and maybe you'll talk about this later on, but we only have 20 minutes left, I think, on this call. So trying to figure out when we're going to get to that point before we kind of continue down this path of solutions.
Absolutely. Callie, James, if you don't mind, I'll take a first crack at it. Feel free to jump in. But Callie, I think that's why we wanted to keep it just very much at the high level. And this was to simply kind of seed a potential, kind of get the juices flowing, as JK mentioned, to start the thinking, because as you'll see in the next couple of slides, we're really moving forward more into these kind of dedicated sessions per each theme. So this is an example of a grouping approach, just to kind of juxtapose not only the level set, but the level set of what it is that we are wanting to formulate problem statements around. So that's kind of why we're pausing here. We'll definitely come back to it, formulating the problem statements around BA level MPM. So James, I don't know if anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think you got it. I wouldn't assume we would be jumping straight to solutions. The purpose of just teeing this up is to highlight what this initiative is going to be thinking about, which is that you've got this existing BA level approach. Let's talk about ways it can be improved. And here is an example of a way it might be improved. But I recognize that, before we do that, we should be clear about principles of mitigation and what problems we're trying to solve.
Okay, I appreciate it. I was just making sure that we weren't kind of skipping what we consider a really vital step in this whole policy process, just so we can, you know, not get to the end of this result and have something that we don't even understand, you know, what problem it's initially trying to address. So appreciate that. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Callie. Let's go ahead and unmute Stephen.
From Southern California, Edison. One thing that would help me to understand some of these issues is to understand the problem that we're here, the potential issues that exist. I have no idea in the BAAs outside of the California BAA, either potentially an EDAM or an EIM, how, you know, how potentially competitive they are. Can you provide any information for those other BAAs? How many independent generation, how much independent generation is there? Maybe how much independent, you know, whether there are any independent LSEs in those areas, or how many LSEs? I mean, I have no idea if we're talking about BAAs that have one LSE and one generation company, or whether there are, you know, several independent generators and several different LSEs.
So what I can do is provide a little bit of history. So in the formation of the EIM, you know, what we talked about in the earlier slides is that the FERC advised California ISO that we could implement mitigation procedures on transfer constraints if we justified that it was needed. And back in the day, the way that we did that is that the Department of Market Monitoring would perform structural competitiveness assessments for EIM entrants. And they did that for Pacificor, East and West, and they did that for Nevada Energy, who was the second group to join the EIM. And what eventually happened is that the thought was, well, more than the conclusion of those two assessments being that the DMM could not conclude that those BAs were structurally competitive based on the factors that you described, the amount of third-party load and third-party owned generation relative to what's owned by the vertically integrated utilities within those BAs. And eventually what happened is that the ISO said, well, it's kind of inefficient to have this process where we have to make the DMM do the structural competitiveness test every time someone wants to join the EIM or show it to FERC. It's just burdensome administratively, when more than likely the EIM entities are you know, at least back in the day, the ones that were looking to join the EIM at the time, the thought was, well, more than likely we're going to find the same results, that the same as Pacificor, East and West, and Nevada. You know, we can't assume that they're structurally competitive. And so what that meant was in the EIM, we enabled this sort of mitigation for all future and present EIM entrants by definition, and did no longer conducted these structural competitiveness tests to apply. So the working assumption in the EIM is that if you're not the CAISO BAA, you're not deemed structurally competitive by default. Now, one thing I say before I move on is that the mitigation test itself is also sort of a test of structural competitiveness at the time that the constraint's binding, by looking at whether or not there's pivotal supply in the EIM area at the time the constraint's binding. So the BA MPN test itself is almost sort of a at the moment test of structural competitiveness for the BA it's testing. So it's sort of replaced that.
Yeah, no, I understand that and I appreciate it, but I think it would help me to understand what we're talking about if I, you know, just to understand that out of the, forget how many it is, 20 some EIM entities now joined, you know, whether there are any independent generation or independent LSEs in any of those entities, and, you know, and how widespread it is. I realize that, you know, and the assumption seems to make sense that each of them is probably not structurally competitive. But, you know, as we're talking about market power mitigation and you're like grouping the BAs, which, you know, seems like a reasonable idea, but it would help me to know, you know, like in this grouping that you have up there, are there 3 generators in there, or are there, you know, 6 generators in there? Yeah, I'd just like to have an idea of, you know, kind of what we're dealing with this.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I do remember, like, I remember looking at this, like, oh, I can't even remember, probably 4 or 5 years ago in EIM. And I think at that point, there were like 2 independent generators somewhere in EIM, and they participated for a short period of time and then stopped. But I mean, that's just, you know, it's kind of like level setting to let us know what we're dealing with here.
Yeah. No, Stephen, just, and I'm sorry, just in the interest of time, I think that's precisely, what you're sharing there is precisely what the Slido poll on the next slide is trying to capture.
Okay.
And we have about 12 minutes to go here. So well, if you wouldn't mind putting that in, we'll capture that and we'll be able to move forward. If we could move to the next slide here. And to that point, right, the session today, and Callie, I think to your point as well, was really to kind of inform the discussion moving forward, which starts with that formulation of problem statement. So it was to provide that history in the current construct of BAA level MPM. So really kind of a 2-part question. Do you feel like this purpose was met? Do you feel as a stakeholder informed informed to continue the conversation into the problem statement formulation? And if not, what are the specific topics that require further information or discussion? So, Stephen, I think that's precisely kind of what you were getting at, what you would like to see and know. I think there are a couple of other, you know, resources we might be able to point you to for that. But if we could go ahead and open the Slido polling here, would really like to hear from this community. You know, if this purpose was met of the current session today, but I think more particularly the second question, if not, which specific topics would you like to have further information or discussion on? So if we could open the Slido chat, please, or the Slido polling, please.
Yep, stand by 1 second.
Okay, we are getting responses in. Sounds like the majority, the vast majority of people feel like this, the intent of today, right, to provide that history and kind of a stronger understanding of the current construct of BAA level MPM has been met. So for those that are in a position that you do not feel like this purpose was met today, could we go ahead and open the open text question so we can capture the specific topics that might require further information? And you know, this is something that again, I think we're sitting at about 72% of the stakeholder community here felt like this was a sufficient level set. So for those that have specific topics that you'd like for more information, maybe we could leverage some of these different mechanisms that we had discussed in working group number 3, just via posting, more information or perhaps an informational session depending on the feedback here to this question to address those topics. So I'm going to put an NA here just so I can see what is coming in. And let's give it just a little bit of time here. We are also, again, going to thank you, George. So let's see. All right, here we have, I think the purpose for today was met, but feel more information is needed before we discuss potential enhancements. Absolutely, right? Specifically, the need to understand the problem and issues the current design has to warrant its enhancements. I couldn't agree more with that anonymous comment. Now that we have kind of a level set of the current construct, let's start talking about what are the challenges the community may be feeling and formulate those problem statements. We have another here that agreed with the SCE's suggestion that more information about the composition of VAs would be informative. So definitely noted. Frequency of mitigation within the WEIM today, test methodology with Western EIM data to check for how it changes the results. I think great comment there. I think there are definitely some resources that we can point to. And overall agree the construct was very well described. The common theme here, James, so good job and thank you for accepting the invitation to come and kind of level set for us. But that commenter continues to say, I think more details on the MPM test are needed to dive into topics related to testing BAAs individually or as a group, which in a nutshell is kind of the question about whether there should be potential enhancement. So, Christine, you didn't select anonymous, so I apologize, but I am going to just call you out on that one, put your name to it. We are, again, going to have a comment template, so if you wouldn't mind expanding on that in that comment template, I think that would really help us ensure that we're providing what it is that you need. We have a lot of others, so how respective, let's see here. Before EIM participants joined, they were required to submit change in status filings, which included a market power analysis examining the entire EIM footprint. How does this analysis factor into your system level BAA MPM? It seems duplicative. Thank you for that. This is precisely, I think, some of that information that we can put out there and make sure that we're all level set. So let us respond to that one here a little bit later. So I apologize. Again, thank you very much for all of your time here today and for this Slido questions. We will be posting everything that we got on the initiative page, but I do want to move on to the next one. So let's go ahead and close this poll, please. And if we could move on to the next slide, which is really kind of where we wanted to make sure that we could shape the future working group sessions. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but we have 5 minutes here, so please take a look on the bottom right hand of your screen. This is in essence, a ranking. So this is to date some of the main themes that we feel that we've captured throughout this working group process. There is going to be, of course, a open text question for anything that you might need to add or you feel should be added, right? Which other themes should be considered for the discussion here. But these are for dedicated working group sessions, so we can get into the weeds of creating the problem statements so that we can then inform the policy development. So really quickly, just go ahead and click those in order, but we would really like to hear from you which of these are the most important to you, and if any additional themes should be captured and included here. So how to reflect the value of reliability and prices during scarce conditions, the triggering mechanism and timing, both the start and end of scarcity pricing, Something that we heard quite a bit as well is out-of-market actions impact to the CAISO markets, scarcity pricing, competitiveness with bilateral markets, compatibility with pricing and RA in the broader West and other markets to signal that voluntary supply. And then again, we are going to leave it open for anything else that you would like added. We are also going to have this particular section for any of you who are watching this via recording or would like to take a little bit of time. Again, we had a robust discussion. We will have that in the comment template as well. So let's go ahead. Let's leave a little bit of time here for a couple others to weigh in. I know that this one's kind of multiple clicks as you kind of go through the entirety of creating the priority list here. All right, so let's go ahead. Let's give it another minute or so. Brenda, I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to leave you with a very short runway to wrap us up, but I really want to make sure that we capture these thoughts, at least initially through the Slido poll. I think that the presentation of where you are, so if you've already put yours in, you can see kind of where the community is at. Again, we will provide that comment template as another vehicle for you to communicate this as well. So right now I'm seeing, you know, it's a pretty dead heat here, but the how to reflect the value of reliability and prices is kind of topic number one. I know we had a lot of discussion on that in working group number one. So also the triggering mechanism, you know, the out-of-market actions and competitiveness of bilateral markets seem to be pretty tight as well. So let's go ahead and at 11:58 now, if you don't mind, let's go ahead and close this one out because I really want to leave this one open. It's not an exhaustive list. Which other themes should be considered? You know, this was our attempt to try to group what we've heard for kind of deeper discussion in these areas, to formulate those problem statements, to understand the issues that the entire community is seeing in these areas, but it was by no means meant to be an exhaustive list. Please let us know. I'm going to go ahead and put my NA in here in order to move us forward. What other themes should be considered for discussion in a dedicated working group session? Ideally, what we'd like to do is frame that session so that multiple stakeholders could either present or move forward. I'm getting a lot of NAs or none to suggest. Again, you will have an opportunity via the comment template to also provide your feedback on this, which additional themes should be considered for a dedicated working group. Heterogeneity in the value of lost load, or i.e., we should be wary of setting value of lost load at the highest willingness to pay among load. So I appreciate that comment. I think that falls kind of into that first bullet. So absolutely, please feel free to kind of expand on that. But I think you know, that topic, so to speak, falls under that theme of how to reflect the value of reliability, and we'd love to hear from you. I'd like to encourage everybody to be very active, you know, not just through the comments, but verbally. That dialogue is what we're looking for. Consequences of BAAs that continue to exercise market power. The applicability of shortage pricing when DR or strategic reserves are active warrants its own meeting. This is reflected in the when it applies and the out-of-market topic listed, but I think it's a very specific set of conditions that can be addressed. So Sybil, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate your participation there, and noted, right? I think those two are pretty close together. And again, these are just themes, so those could fall under that for a more robust discussion. So I hope to hear from you, and you know, potentially you could you could share your thoughts and speak your mind via a presentation. Real-time multi-interval optimization, producing suboptimal economic storage dispatches. So Sean, thank you for that. We will definitely see where, if not, we can't fit that into these broader themes. So out-of-market, another comment here, out-of-market actions not just within the CAISO. One of the impacts of California RA is that it functions as a type of MPM by ensuring that under most conditions there are sufficient resources bidding into the market. It goes on to say in EDAM, even with RAP, this is not the case. How does this impact MPM in non-CAISO areas? Obviously we don't have a, we wanted to have this level set, session here. So we did not have anything with BAA level MPM, but appreciate that. Let us see here. Let's go ahead. Oh, I'm running 2 minutes over. I apologize. Thank you everybody for your time. Again, that comment template will be out with time for you to provide your feedback. So let's go ahead and hand it off to Brenda to wrap us up.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan, so much. As our facilitator for the Price Formation Working Group, I appreciate adding the Slido tool. We are definitely getting a lot of good feedback. As well mentioned, we do have a commenting template that we will be opening up in the next few days. So give us a little time to get that sorted out for everyone to provide feedback, as well as the working group schedule at this time is all tentative. We will provide the upcoming working group date very soon with a notice, and most likely we'll let you know if that's going to be hybrid or virtual. But this time we definitely saw a lot of participation from everyone. And at this time, we like to close this and let you know that the presentation's posted on the stakeholder website, as well as the attendee list. And for the upcoming meetings we have coming up for our stakeholder group, we will have the option for everyone to register and to receive those call-in details. So keep an eye out for that for most of our upcoming meetings. Be sure to register so you'll get an email as well. You'll be able to see everyone who's attending that specific meeting. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. If not, I'll go ahead and close this call and pass it back to Adrian to close this call for us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining our conference. You may now disconnect.